Hi everyone, thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today we are at Canyonlands National Park in Utah, and we sat down with Karen Henker, who has been a park ranger at Canyonlands and Arches National Parks for nearly 20 years. We talk all about the geology of this area, wildlife that exists here, and the long history of humans in these parks. Karen, thanks for doing this podcast. We have this beautiful backdrop of arches behind us, but we're going to talk about Canyonlands in this one.
Yeah, happy to.
Let's start though first with you and your career. I have walked around with you for a couple of days now in the park. It seems like you're very well known and you have tenure in this area. So how has your career been with the National Park Service?
Well, I've been with the Park Service in some capacity for a little over 20 years, 18 of which actually have been right here, which is very unusual. I spent 5 years working at Canyonlands National Park, another 5 here at Arches National Park, and then for the last 8, I've kind of supported both parks, mostly in the field of interpretation, messaging, media, working with the frontline staff who are then working with visitors.
You mentioned to me off camera that the reason why you wanted to work here was because you want to make people fall in love with it just as you have. And what better way to make a living than to talk about a place you love so much? What made you fall in love with this area, and why did you want to combine your two passions?
Oh, yeah. I didn't know I was going to be a park ranger growing up. I kind of fell into it after college and realized pretty quickly that it was quite an opportunity for me to harness a couple of different things that I love. Being outdoors, working with people, helping people make that connection to the outdoors. And as an interpretive ranger, I do think that falling in love with place is an essential job skill. Being able to take that passion and align it with others, with the passion of others, with what visitors are coming to see. Why did I fall in love with this landscape? Do you need me to tell you that? Really, it is almost obscenely beautiful. So much of the state of Utah is. If beauty alone were the qualifier, the whole dang state could be a national park. And we are kind of lucky to have 5 really incredible ones here. And personally, I feel lucky to be able to support 2 of them, plus 2 national monuments just a couple hours to the south.
Well, in this episode, we're going to focus on Canyonlands, and then we're going to do another episode a little later on about Arches. Mm-hmm. We were at Canyonlands earlier this morning. It is very windy. They got some snow last night, so we are at Arches right now near the Visitors Center. But let's talk about the general geology of Canyonlands. It almost feels like it's right across the street from Arches, but it's so drastically different than this park. Why is that?
Well, a couple of reasons. Canyonlands National Park is a whole lot bigger than Arches, more than 4 times the size. It encompasses the area around the confluence of the Green and the Colorado rivers. And the elevations within Canyonlands range from 6,000 feet clear down to below 4,000 feet, all the way from the tip top of the canyons down to the bottom where the rivers are. So a whole lot of diversity of the landscape. It is just a little bit south of where we are here at Arches National Park. It has a couple of rock layers in common. The bottom one you can see here, the Navajo sandstone that's real pale, that's the bottom layer at Arches, but it's the top layer at Canyonlands National Park, even though Canyonlands National Park is 2,000 feet higher in elevation. That's interesting, right? And right there, that speaks to just how much deep underground forces have been at work transforming these landscapes, working, fault lines, pushing things up, buckling things, transforming things. It gives us the incredible diversity of landforms that you see here that make this place so beautiful.
Yeah, you mentioned the landforms. What can be seen inside of Canyonlands? Obviously Arches, the namesake here, but at Canyonlands, there's a whole lot of biodiversity there, and there's 3 distinct districts. What can you see in each of those districts, and what really, to you, makes Canyonlands special?
Yeah, well, first I gotta acknowledge that Canyonlands National Park has over 300 named arches, which would be amazing anywhere else if we didn't have this place right across the street. So anyhow, but of course there are the canyons of the Green and the Colorado River that kind of define the park, but most visitors aren't actually gonna be down in those canyons. They're gonna probably be experiencing Canyonlands from the Island in the Sky district. That gets most of our visitation because it's the easiest to get to in just a normal passenger vehicle. And that district is between the two rivers. It's way up at 6,000 feet with just tremendous views in all directions. You're actually looking far outside the park boundary from most of those viewpoints. A lot of that land is still public land. It's mostly administered by the Bureau of Land Management, or we have some mountain ranges nearby that are administered by the National Forest Service. So you're still enmeshed in your public lands, but I like to remind folks it's not all national park out here, you know? Anyhow, so big views are really what that Island in the Sky district is about. To the south, there's a district called the Needles, which from that name, you can guess, they're these tower-like formations that kind of stick up at you. Over 50 miles of hiking trail down there. You're immersed in that landscape, hiking over, under, through, between all these like sculptures of rock. And then you got the Maze District, which is to the west side of the Green River. There is no paved road anywhere near the Maze District. You've got to drive over 50 miles of dirt road just to get to the ranger station to get your permit to go another couple hours to get into the maze. It is rugged, raw, the way a lot of the desert Southwest once looked before it was developed to the towns we have today. So folks who go out there, they're going out there on an adventure, on a journey. They're self-sufficient and they're looking for some solitude, which is one thing that is easy to find in the maze.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I've been enthralled with the maze and learning about it over the last couple of weeks. Why do you think is it important for people to experience what the desert Southwest was before development occurred? What kind of connection, just as a human being, can you have when seeing a landscape that's almost untouched?
Well, you know, not everybody wants to experience that, and I'm going to acknowledge that. A lot of people, you know, come to Moab because they're doing the Grand Circle tour or the Mighty Five tour. They're not going to spend a week deep in the backcountry, and that is absolutely fine. In fact, that's great. You can have great memories just from doing short day hikes here. For the folks who are seeking something a little more intimate and long-lasting like that, I think there can be a lot of reasons, you know. Many people's modern lives are just so hustle, bustle, fraught with technology and deadlines and all the things. Escaping that for a few days and just being a human being in a natural landscape where it's so quiet you can't not hear your own thoughts, that's precious and that's powerful for folks who want that. Not everybody wants it, though.
Yeah, I agree. So oftentimes you pair the Colorado River and you think of a canyon, your mind obviously probably goes to the Grand Canyon, especially if you're not somebody who travels through the national parks often. What makes Canyonlands so unique and different than the Grand Canyon?
The Grand Canyon, yeah. Well, we get that comparison a lot. You know, the Grand Canyon, of course, is quite famously deep. It is several times deeper than the canyons that we have up here because we're further north on that same system. But of course, I like to say Canyonlands has two rivers instead of just one, and we have views in all directions. Whereas most people who go to the Grand Canyon, they're just seeing it from that south rim, and it takes an awful lot of work to get down into that canyon and back out again. Whereas Canyonlands, it's easier to get to, and there's a lot more diversity in your views and the kinds of adventures that you can have here.
How does the Colorado Plateau and elevation of the high desert affect the geology and the climate and everything that entails with these two parks?
Wow, that's a huge question. So yeah, let's start with the Colorado Plateau. That's a term not everybody's familiar with. It basically is a physiographic province that centers around the four corners of the southwest of the US. It's about 130,000 square miles. And what makes it kind of unique is that it's stayed geologically rather stable for a very long time. And what I mean by that is it hasn't had a lot of faulting or tilting or like volcanic activity within the middle of it. All of those things have happened around the side of it. But what's really happened with the Colorado Plateau is it's kind of lifted up over the millennia, but stayed pretty flat. What that means is that these landscapes of Arches, Canyonlands, this whole region, people are going to see kind of like a ladder of rock layers, or some people call it a pancake stack of rock layers that's still more or less flat, level, other than where it's been subjected to some local tilting because of some other things we can talk about. But the rock is exposed to us hundreds of thousands of years, hundreds of millions of years of development of the Earth's layers are revealed to us. And that's just hard to wrap your brain around. But for people who are into rocks, like me, like a lot of folks, it's astounding, and it's worth spending some time in.
What you just mentioned, the other area that we can talk about of the lifting.
Yes.
What is that?
What is that,
Yeah.
right? I tried to make you curious.
You baited me.
Yes, I do that. So when people travel around here, if they're interested in the geology at all, pretty quickly they're going to hear about salt, which sounds weird, like there's no pile of salt here. Well, there is, we just can't see it because it's a couple thousand feet under us right now. But what we've come to understand is there was once a sea that kind of got trapped and evaporated here several times. And during that time, just a lot of salt, kind of built up, right? But then other rock layers were deposited on top of that salt, sandstones and mudstones and shales and clays, building up on top of a foundation of salt. Well, a foundation of salt is not stable. Even in a rock form, it still kind of oozes and squeezes, and it can push up into those overlying rock layers. With enough force, it can actually crack them. So that underground tilting and pushing and cracking that the salt has done has directly influenced the shapes that we see in the rocks today. Cracking, of course, lets water in to a rock. And then water has played the major role in sculpting, eroding, shaping these landforms.
Can you talk a little bit more in detail on the Colorado and Green River and how exactly it carved Canyonlands?
Yeah, I love talking about that actually, because the Colorado and Green River definitely have formed the canyons, but the water in those rivers ain't ever going to splash up on the side of a cliff 2,000 feet above it, right? So the beautiful sculptured landscapes that we're seeing, they're not actually formed by the rivers. They are formed by every rainfall. All the water that's trapped in these rocks today, freezing, because we are freezing.
We are right now.
That ice is pushing on the sides of the rock. We call that frost wedging. And when that happens in the right place, it can actually pop a rock right off the side of the cliff. These are small changes, but when they're happening over and over, every rainstorm forms a little, gully, and that little stream goes to the edge of the cliff, and there's a waterfall that goes off. Those waterfalls are carving back the edge of the cliff, and they're carrying gravel and sand and debris with them that are kind of like scouring the rock, eroding it even more. Eventually that water is going to get down into the river. I kind of think of the rivers as, this isn't very attractive, but the gutters of the system. Like, they're just taking the water away. They're taking that debris away. They're doing their own carving too. But it's all those other processes at work that are really shaping the land.
The power of erosion.
The power of erosion. It's undeniable, especially here where it rains, like last night.
And I oftentimes, when I'm at parks like these, I'm inspired by the beauty, and then I also think about what kind of geological violence had to take place in order to create something so beautiful over time, which is odd to think about, violence creating something beautiful like this, but we're talking about millions of years of erosion and tectonic activity, and then the aftermath, that we live in this perfect space of time where we can see these beautiful places is amazing.
Yeah. One of our geologists who lives here in town said something once I'll never forget. She said, geology is incredibly slow, except for when it's not. Right? And that can happen sometimes. We do have rock falls that occur in the park. They're not something that people, need to be super worried about, but it's something to keep in mind. A sandstone landscape is a friable landscape. So when you're hiking around in these places, you do have to be aware of the cliff edges. People who do climb in these places use very different techniques than you would use climbing on granite, for example, you know. It is a very changing landscape, and especially if you're planning to go out on like four-wheel drive roads, dirt roads, you really have to check the current conditions, because yeah, there could have been a rock fall or a mudslide or something that's going to change your plans.
You just alluded to a lot of it, but what are some of the safety concerns with visitors and safety tips with visitors when they're hiking in Canyonlands based on the geology that you've talked about?
Yeah, well, you know, I think the biggest difference that can shock people when they come out here, especially if they're coming here from like a more forested landscape where you're hiking in a place where it's so obvious where the trail is because it's where the trees aren't, right? Well, in a rock landscape, it's not obvious. A lot of the trails at Canyonlands, you're just walking clear across the rock, and we don't use things like paint on the trail to mark it. We tend to use more natural things like little stacks of rocks called cairns, or maybe we'll take some brush or logs to kind of put on the sides of the trail. But it can be subtle. You really have to be paying attention. And that can be tough, you know, when you're on vacation, you're hiking with your family, you're having fun, you're all chit-chatting, and then you go, wait a minute, where's the trail? So that's the biggest tip I would give to people if you're hiking in this landscape. Absolutely have a great time, have fun, but make sure you're paying attention, because it is really easy to get lost, even a little bit lost, and you don't want to get a lot lost, because that can ruin your whole day or worse. So
there's a lot of natural processes in place at both Arches and Canyonlands that are changing the landscape, but unfortunately humans can add to that and unnaturally change the landscape. What are ways that humans do that, and what are tips on how to let the environment play out naturally and not leave our footprint on it when we're exploring?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because both Arches and Canyonlands, unfortunately, have a fairly persistent problem with graffiti. I use the word graffiti, and a lot of people might immediately be thinking of spray paint on a subway. And we use the term a little differently here. Because of the nature of sandstone, if you just pick up one piece of rock, it's real easy to scratch on another piece of rock. And some visitors find that a temptation that they don't resist. You might think from looking at it like, oh, it's not a big deal, it's just going to wash off the next time it rains. But then remember, this is a desert. How often does it rain here? Not a lot. We get 10 cubic inches of rain a year. We can easily go a month or two without any rain. And during that month or two, tens of thousands of people are seeing what was scratched on the rock. They might be inclined to add their own. And that changes this landscape. People don't come here to see that. People come to see this. So I would ask that folks choose to make memories in other ways, you know? Yeah.
And how about off-trail hiking in Canyonlands? I know you said it's easy to get off-trail if you're not paying attention just by the natural processes of it, but is there any concerns over visitors going off-trail just to explore different areas that may be off-limits or might be, you know, danger zones in the park?
Less so with that. I think most visitors have a pretty healthy sense of, oh, gee, this is a big cliff.
Yeah.
You know, although on occasion we do encounter people who've gotten themselves cliffed out because they've wanted to do a little bit of exploring on the rock. In terms of staying on trail, one message that we do definitely want visitors to understand is that this desert landscape has some really sensitive parts to it. A lot of the trails are on rock, but between the stretches of rock, they're going to encounter this stuff called biological soil crust or biocrust. It looks like this, like crunchy if you touched it, but please don't, layer that forms right on the soil surface. It's a couple centimeters thick. It's often dark in color, but not always. And it's alive. It has living organisms in it that are providing nutrients to the soil. And if you step on it, not only does it kill those organisms, but it impacts the health of that little tiny ecosystem supporting the plant life right there. So a lot of the trails in Canyonlands, you'll see this crust on both sides. And we just ask folks to stay on the trail, single file if necessary, to preserve what's on the sides.
You talked about how long this park has taken to develop and the many millions of years of history that you can just turn around and look at this rock and observe right now. Some evidence of that too is when you drive in, there's some dinosaur statues outside the park. They have found dinosaur bones in the parks here. But even more than that, human history. And Canyonlands has some really special human history that you can actually see. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, just to clarify, people were not riding dinosaurs here. So, you can do that at that park that you mentioned if you want. But yeah, the geologic history of the park does go back 300 million years, which is even older than dinosaurs. But the human history here is since time immemorial. That is what our tribal partners tell us, that people are a part of this landscape. Archaeologists have found evidence of at least 10 to 12,000 years back, and that would have been kind of the tail end of the Ice Age. They have found spearheads that are only appropriate if you're hunting something like a mastodon. Wow, very different landscape here back then. But there have been multiple peoples, multiple cultures that have come through this landscape over those many thousands of years. And their descendant communities are still here. A lot of them don't live right in the Moab area anymore. And some of that is because of the history of our country and how peoples were forced onto reservations. And that's something that's an unfortunate fact, but I think it's important to acknowledge that folks are no longer living here now, but they still have a very strong connection to these landscapes. So Canyonlands National Park has over 20 traditionally associated tribes that would include the Hopi, the Zuni, Paiute, Ute, a lot of the Pueblo tribes, the Navajo as well. And those descendant communities tell us that the places that people can see in the park today that are preserving some of their ancestral homelands, or where people traveled through on seasonal hunting or migrations. Some of the things people can see in Canyonlands are structures made of stone, carefully built sometimes into nooks in the rock as though they're part of the rock landscape, because of course they are. As well as painted or carved designs, which are called pictographs or petroglyphs. There are actually two sections of Canyonlands that are considered on the National Register of Historic Places as archaeological districts. One of them is in the Needles District. It's the Salt Creek zone. Because there is a lot of water there, there's an abundant evidence of people using that area through time. But then, of course, the Horseshoe Canyon section of Canyonlands is kind of an isolated little satellite unit out near the maze, and that has a feature in it called the Great Gallery, which is one of a number of panels of pictographs primarily. But the Great Gallery has over 100 figures, some of them as much as 8 feet tall, that are made of different mineral pigments painted onto the sandstone wall in a way that has groupings of figures, an undeniable power to places like this. A lot of visitors approach them with curiosity. They want to know, what do these designs mean? And I understand that curiosity, but I also encourage people to recognize that different cultures find different meanings in things, and we may never know what the original creators meant. We also may not know what the descendant communities believe those pieces to mean, and that's absolutely okay. Those cultural differences are part of what make up the composition of humanity, and just recognizing those differences is powerful too.
I can hear the passion in your voice when you talk about...
Oh, I know, I talk so much.
When you talk about the Great Gallery. Why are you so passionate and enthralled with it? I know you mentioned you've been there a couple of times, and each time you're, I don't know if I have the right word for it, but you're obviously taken to a whole different place of what you're feeling and experiencing. Why is that for you?
These places are powerful, and I have chosen in my career with the National Park Service to mostly work at what would be considered nature parks, right? Like parks with big landscapes. I will probably never work at a national battlefield or a historic homestead, but these natural parks have also always been human landscapes. And I love to connect with that. I did spend 5 years working and actually living in Canyonlands. And on my days off, I would, go on hikes and whatever, and I'm out there, hiking with my backpack, and I find a nice shady spot to sit and have a snack. And I can't tell you the number of times I'd be enjoying some shade and enjoying a view, and in that moment, I would see something like a potsherd or an arrowhead or a place where somebody sat to make an arrowhead, right? It leaves these things called flakes on the ground. And I would just be transported through time in that moment, realizing another human being hundreds of years ago, maybe thousands of years ago, enjoyed that same shade. Blows my mind. And that's a part of these national parks experiences that not all visitors take the time to really thinking about, because they're bumping around and getting their pictures for their Instagram, and that is cool and great too. But for those who are more interested in the cultural story, Canyonlands is a great place to experience that.
So for the people who do come here to experience the human history part of it, what are some tips that you've noticed, that you've experienced, that made you appreciate, the humans that have been here? And what are ways that you can kind of respect and honor that when you're here?
I am so glad that you asked that question, actually, because we work really hard to both preserve these cultural landscapes for people to experience, but at the same time do minimal work to separate the visitor from these places. When you're hiking out in the backcountry of Canyonlands, you might find some of these things and they're not going to have a safety fence built around them. We are, in doing that, relying on the partnership of visitors in respecting that these places are not only ancient and special, but in some cases actually sacred to the descendant communities. And so to approach them with respect, which often means to not approach them too closely. Certainly never put your hands on any of the pictographs or petroglyphs, because the oils in your skin can actually damage those images. But even a structure that's made of stone, if it's been standing there for 700 years without mortar to hold those stones together, a simple elbow bump could actually take that rock wall down, and we would lose those hundreds of years of history in that place. So yeah, visitors approaching with respect, thinking about the significance of these places is going to be essential in their continued preservation.
I'm glad you said that, because and speaking and hearing from tribe members that have existed in these places, as you mentioned, since time immemorial, they oftentimes say, even with archaeological digs, and I know there's laws governing this with the parks and in the United States, but when we see evidence of human history, our first, maybe, originally my first thought was like, why don't we have an archaeological dig and explore this and learn the story? But the tribes don't want that. It's a story. That area you're viewing is a story. Not every story needs to be dug up, and when you're doing an archaeological dig, unfortunately, it's messy, and it can destroy the story that was sitting there. So it's important, as you mentioned, to embrace it and understand that you're in the same area as people from thousands of years ago. But not every story needs to be dug up and totally learned about.
Yeah. My background actually before Park Service was in anthropology, which is not the same as archaeology. But I've definitely read a lot of the evolution of these sciences. They went through that era of digging everything up, and that's how come pieces have worked their way into museums across the country and across the world. And Canyonlands is definitely one of the parks that is continuing to engage with our tribal partners and talk frankly about some things that might need to come out of museums and go back into the landscape. We certainly do not take things out of the landscape anymore unless it is determined to be at risk. For example, a number of years back, some hikers out at the Great Gallery saw something starting to erode out of the ground. And oh, wow, this gives me goosebumps. It not just because of the wind. It was a pouch, a leather pouch that had contained within it everything that person needed for their hike, their journey that day. It had a bag of some seeds, it had some tools, it had a little, I think it had a little bone needle and some yucca fiber threads, you know, and it was eroding out of the dirt in such a way that these visitors were worried that it might get stolen. The visitors did not pull it out of the ground and bring it to a park ranger, which happens sometimes. Well-intended people will pick things up and bring them into the visitor center and say, you gotta protect this. Unfortunately, when that happens, they've just lost the whole story behind that object because they removed it from the place. Mm-hmm. So instead, the visitors just reported it so that the park archaeologists could go out, do a site assessment, and make a determination. And then they actually did reach out to the tribes and do what's called consultation, getting the tribes' input on what they would prefer to see done with this object. So I believe the final determination did involve a removal from that specific place, because obviously it wasn't stable anymore, but also returning the object to the place, because it doesn't need to be in a museum, it needs to be home.
Well, the human story here is really, really special. And I know another thing that visitors often come to parks for is to experience wildlife. And each park has its own set of wildlife that roams and explores based on the ecosystem that's in place here. So what ecosystem is here that supports the wildlife, and what wildlife is here?
Yeah. Well, we are what's considered a high desert, in that we're between 4,000 and 6,000 feet elevation. And it is pretty dry, only about 10 cubic inches of rain a year. And so we don't have a lot of resources to support a lot of big wildlife. Probably the largest creatures that live in the park would on occasion be things like mountain lions or black bears, which are not seen with any kind of frequency. What visitors are going to encounter most of all is pretty small wildlife. Rodents, although a lot of those are nocturnal, again, because of that high desert environment. Creatures are going to adapt as best they can to avoid that heat. But visitors will see things like white-tailed antelope squirrels. They are active even in the hottest summer day, just running around with their little white tail up over their back like a little parasol, extremely cute. Of course, lizards in a landscape like this. I also like reminding people to look up for wildlife. We do have something like several hundred species of birds in the park. Probably the most commonly seen one, or heard, would be the raven. They love to be wherever we are because they have figured out how to beg food off people. Or just drag it out of the trash can. Or just take it right off your picnic table while your back is turned. So another thing visitors can keep in mind when they're visiting these places is they are sharing it with creatures who live here, many of whom are smart enough to have figured us out, but not smart enough to figure out the difference between our snacks and the plastic bag they came in. And when they eat that plastic bag, that can be fatal. So a great way visitors can help preserve the wildlife, protect the wildlife that live here, is just keeping their food on lockdown, or anything that smells like food, trash, anything. There are some places in the backcountry, especially of the Needles district of Canyonlands, that do actually require bear sacks or bear canisters, because during certain times of year, bear will come up the drainages and into those camping areas.
We were laughing a little earlier today about ravens and how smart they are, because I saw a massive one in Canyonlands.
Yeah.
If a raven is stealing your food off your picnic table, if you fight them, they will probably find your car and rip your windshield wipers apart. They're smart and they have unbelievable.
They'll remember your face.
Yes, they remember you. They are unbelievable, and it's funny because we think of ravens as being just such common birds because they're everywhere, really, in the United States. I think there's two states in the U.S. that they aren't in. And so we see them so frequently, and sometimes it's easy to forget how smart and intelligent they really are, but they adapt to every landscape and they just figure stuff out. Arches, specifically, is really one road that goes through the park. So how important is speed limit when it comes to wildlife?
Really glad that you're asking about that. Of course, speed limits are always important. They're the law. Also, you're here on vacation. Why rush? You know, keeping a nice slow speed means that you get to see more. And seeing roadkill is not the way people want to see wildlife in the park. So yeah, we do have things. I mentioned a lot of our animals are either nocturnal or crepuscular, which is a super fun word. That means you're predominantly active at like dawn and dusk. So things like jackrabbits, cottontails, and then of course, whoever eats jackrabbits and cottontails, right? So you do have things like bobcat in the park, a couple different types of fox. Not commonly seen, but if people are up and about because they want to get a nice early start on their hike, they might encounter critters like that. Conversely, if you are camping in the park or just stay up through sunset, Canyonlands and Arches both are home to over 15 species of bats, which kind of are my favorite creatures in the entire world. They are amazing and they are much maligned. There's a lot of fear about bats, but my goodness, if we didn't have bats, we would live in a solid cloud of mosquitoes at all times, and none of us want that. So all of the bats in these landscapes are insectivores. They're eating mosquitoes, they're eating little bugs and little critters, and some of them start flying right before sunset. The little teeny tiny canyon bats, their bodies are only about this big. They weigh less than a nickel, and they will fly all night long and eat their body weight in mosquitoes. It's just amazing.
I think you just won some people's hearts over with bats and mosquitoes.
They're the best.
What made you fall in love with bats?
Well, they are the only mammal capable of true flight. There are a couple things out there that glide, like, you know, gliding squirrels, but bats can actually take off and they can change direction. They have full aerodynamic control. And bats comprise about 20% of all species of mammals. There are over 1,000 species of bats alone, which surprises a lot of people because bats are active when we aren't and often where we aren't. Right? Obviously, they're in the sky, but they tend to hang out in places that people don't find accommodating, you know, caves or little cracks in the bark. That's where a lot of the bats live here because we don't have big roosting caves like you might find back east or in the southeast. No, I think they're incredible. And I hate mosquitoes.
We were out on an overlook at Canyonlands this morning, and you and Brian Hayes, who is the search and rescue coordinator, and we're going to have an episode out with him next week. But both of you pointed out the Douglas fir across from us.
Oh, right.
And the small community of Douglas fir that are growing inside of Canyonlands, and that story is fascinating. Yeah,
it's a story of change, right? So this high desert landscape that we are in now definitely sees temperatures over 100 degrees in the summer, and it has very little precipitation. That is not what you would normally consider a landscape that can support a Douglas fir forest. Yeah, I did college in the Pacific Northwest. That's what I'm used to for Doug firs, right? You got rain, gray days, all that. We do have Douglas firs living up in the mountains outside of the park, but more like 9,000, 10,000 feet where it's much cooler. The fact that there are Douglas firs still in a couple little pockets of Canyonlands tells us that sometime in the past, this place was also much cooler. And archaeologists combined actually with ecologists have found some really neat evidence of that too. There's this mammal called a pack rat. You've probably heard of it. They're kind of famous for collecting stuff. Like when I was camping one time and I took my watch off and I slept out and I woke up in the morning and instead of my watch, there was a rock. Yeah, a pack rat had traded up at some point in the middle of the night.
That was kind of it.
Real fun, right? Yeah, but they have done that for thousands of years and they live in the same community called a midden. And so archaeologists have been able to go into these middens and explore and find things like seeds and cones, evidence of the plants that used to be in these communities. And so they have found evidence that stuff like Douglas firs and trees that need a whole lot more water, plants that need cooler temperatures, used to dominate this area hundreds of years ago. The climate has shifted. Now, I'm not saying that that's the same as the rapid human-caused climate change that we're experiencing today, but it is true that climates do change slowly over time as natural processes. So yeah, these little pockets of Douglas fir can remind us of that. Also, they remind me that, if you find your right niche, as these Doug firs have, they're in a little north-facing alcove with lots of shade and a nice water source, you can survive even in tough places.
I love that. It's a good message. Nature can teach you a lot of things, which is special. I even said sometimes nature can dictate how you handle the day, and you reminded me that nature always dictates the day, which is very true.
She is always calling the shots. It's true.
What do you find special about these places and just about outdoors in general? What inspires you about being out here?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in California. I grew up in the Bay Area. Nothing but pavement for miles in all directions. I was lucky that I got to camp as a kid, though, and learn a connection with nature, which not all kids get, so I do feel gratitude for that. But absolutely, as an adult, when I am just up to my eyeballs in emails, and yes, park rangers, that's part of our reality too. I ride a desk a whole lot more than anything else. But knowing that all it takes is giving myself the time to step away from that desk, turn off that phone, go outside, sit on a rock that's made of little ground up pieces of a landscape over 100 million years ago. It grounds me. I don't do it often enough, but every single time I do it, I'm glad that I did.
That's awesome. It's special hearing that from a person who lives here, and you've been in these parks for 20 plus years, and you live in the Moab area, which I'm driving around here, and it's all camper vans and all off-roading vehicles, people who are obsessed and love with the outdoors. And for that to not ever wear off really shows you the power of how incredible and inspirational these places are.
Yeah, it never gets old. How could it?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, any final thoughts about Canyonlands that you want to leave the viewers and listeners with?
Canyonlands, well, it's a massive park. I mentioned it has a couple of different districts. There's a lot to see and do here. So if people are planning a trip to Canyonlands, I recommend that they look closely at their fitness level, their equipment level, how much time they want to spend here, and pick which adventure to have. Don't try to do it all at once. Every trip to Canyonlands, well, really every trip to the Moab area is a scouting trip for the next trip back, right? Because we're going to be here. That's the great thing about being national parks, right? We are preserved for the long game. You can come out, have an adventure, get excited about your next adventure. But doing proper planning is the best way to make it a safe adventure that you can walk away from with happy memories and come back. That's always going to be our number one.
Well, we're going to do another episode in a little bit about arches specifically, but for now we're going to go inside and warm up and get ready for our other upcoming podcast. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. I had an absolute blast speaking with Karen. Her knowledge and passion for these parks is so special to listen to, and I really love her perspective on the humans that have existed and continue to exist in this area. So if you liked this episode, it'd mean a whole lot if you liked, commented, or subscribed wherever you're watching or listening to it from. And until next time, safe travels.